My name is Déniel Véri. I'm working here at ChemKey's research department. I will be chairing this session. It's a great honor to welcome you, the participants, and the audience. So I would like to introduce the panel. It's titled Institutions of Friendship, and our first speaker will be Cristian. He's an associate professor at the Gheorghe Enescu National University of the Arts in Iași, Romania, where he teaches critical theory, exhibition studies, and contemporary art history. His research focuses on exhibition history and critical art practices in Eastern and Central Europe after the 1960s. And currently he's a senior advisor in the project Periodization in the History of Art and its Conundrums, How to Tackle Them in East Central Europe, Connecting Art Histories program supported by the Getty Foundation. So Cristian, please.
Thank you, Déniel, for your introduction. I would like also to thank the organizers, Juja and Demeche, for accepting me here to be with you. It's a real pleasure. And I'd like to thank you all who stayed with us to this last panel today. I would like to address today a rather conundrum related to international rather than transnational encounters and exhibitions, and I'll try to, I hope I'll have the right time to do it. And if I go a bit over time, just let me know, okay? Thank you. So there is still an entrenched prejudice about cultural transference that describes it starting from the wrong assumption that elements of a relatively stable cultural structure, which is understood as a borrowed bubble, are inserted within another similar cultural bubble. What I propose is to destabilize such a prejudice today by looking at situation of idiomatic description of the art of the 70s in Romania, as attempts to cope with discontinuities in local artistic practices that were catalyzed by international encounters. Of course, notable efforts have been already done to undo the description of cultural interaction in Central and Eastern Europe as one between self-enclosed national ecosystems, which were in limited and highly regulated contact with similar ones. And those works looked at networks of personal contacts or hubs of translocal communication, and lately at institutional structures that were facilitating transnational circulation. In visual arts, biennial exhibitions are privileged examples of such unstable institutions as Carlos Basualdo's famously characterized them. Therefore, I propose to analyze today the exhibition as a material infrastructure that facilitates cultural transfer, setting in motion people-object theories, as well as descriptive concepts. However, in the artistic ecosystem of the 70s, as Jelena Vesic already pointed out yesterday, few such biennials were transnational, most of them still relying on the format of national participation. So in the Romanian context, the restricted and highly regulated capacity of traveling and accessing information transformed them into privileged opportunities to establish connections and dialogical encounters among the participants. Or at least, when those connections were not direct but indirect, to conversate with other artists in an imaginary horizontal space. In defining the possible effects of such encounters, I also draw on the concept of constellation borrowed from Walter Benjamin and later found in Deleuze and Guattari's writings. Instead of defining a stable structure, a constellation allows for multiple associations and assemblages that are made up from the materials at hand. Regardless of how tightly it might be curated, any constellation of artworks assembled in an exhibition does not create a monological discourse, but rather is open to multiple receptions. It produces manifold effects and generates adaptations and creative translations. Those undermine not only the unidirectional notions of influence and transfer, but also the stability of some descriptive concepts which circulate through this medium. At the same time, the medium of the exhibition, either international or transnational network hub, helps us reveal not only the discontinuities and shifts in the artistic practice of Eastern European artists, but also continuities, equally modeled by informal encounters with friends and by their indirect exposure to other cultural horizons within the state-supported channels of cultural communication and circulation. So I'm looking today somehow beyond personal friendships that have been well documented in our panel yesterday, and most notably perhaps by Clara Kemp-Welch in her book, Networking the Block. And I propose to analyze the role played by these national participations as state-supported international cultural hubs, that facilitated the transfer of ideas and techniques, forging creative adaptations of visual languages within and beyond the aesthetic concept of Central and Eastern European art. For obvious reasons, I will limit myself today in analyzing just 2 cases from Romania's participation to Venice and the Ljubljana Graphic Art Biennials, which instantiate what Thomas Zalewski described as examples of official and unofficial art. One of the main prejudices that I would like also to call upon in this exercise of transversal reading is the divide between official and unofficial art, which I'm trying to consider by looking at the imbrication between national and international exhibitions as part of the same state-supported ecosystem. Basically, I will look today at 2 concepts, or the fate of 2 concepts. One is humanist realism and the other is contextual art. One was used by an art critic, the other by an artist, as attempts to cope with the unstable and shifting positions of certain artistic practices within the expanding artistic field of the time. Humanist realism occurred in art historical discourse as an awkward attempt to describe a particular type of figuration that was produced at the beginning of the 70s. It was forged as a combination between the political doctrine of socialist humanism and the aesthetics of socialist realism, and it tried to account for the shift in local political context after Khrushchev's 1961 discourse as an attempt to tolerate and thus to contain and perhaps instrumentalize figurative language. Under Ceaușescu's political regime, socialist humanism became a state doctrine. Culturally, it affirmed the emancipatory goal of art, which celebrates the advancement of the human condition. Elaborate theoretical notions may be found in Ceaușescu's famous July thesis from 1971, which reaffirmed the control of the state over artistic production, but were most clearly laid down in a book bearing his name, because I very much doubt that he wrote it actually. It was published in 1974 and entitled Socialist Humanism. In this book, one finds the pillars of this more advanced version of socialism, which places the human in the center of its doctrine, and any authentic humanism should therefore be revolutionary. But the social progress requires the transformation of the human through this revolutionary consciousness and moral education, which are to be achieved only in conjunction with economic, scientific, and last but not least, cultural progress. In Romanian art history, the term was used by Magda Cârneci alongside that of experimental realism to describe artworks from the activity of Ion Bițan in the early 70s, such as the portrait of zootechnician Timur that you are seeing now, or the 1st of May, presented within the National Biennial Exhibitions of Fine Arts, which translate official language glorifying work and celebrating socialist achievements into a mixed media collage, employing multiple techniques in a baffling example of artistic virtuosity and malleability. He was flirting with both pop art, new figuration, and socialist realism at the same time. Bițan worked in series that spread over long periods of time. The unsettling character of this particular cycle of Bițan's works, which includes artworks that were presented in much acclaim in national biennials, such as The Fruits of Work, lies in the imbrication of formal compositional elements such as loose brushstrokes, silkscreen photography, drawing, and flattened composition reminiscent not only of collage, but also of cinematic crops and the bande dessinée, adapted to socialist topics. The widespread explanation for these artworks lies in Bițan's encounter with Robert Rauschenberg at the 1964 Venice Biennale, where he also participated representing Romania. And this is advocated by Bițan himself and was confirmed by his daughter. Bițan's encounter with Rauschenberg's works within the American Pavilion was facilitated, as I was saying, by his own participation. But its belated referencing is the result of a cultural detente that the term humanist realism was attempting to capture. Usually, what I prefer to call here a visual referencing of Rauschenberg's compositions is described as a process of unidirectional Western influence, a stylistic inflection closely related to pastiche, grafted upon and adapted to local political constraints. But what if, reversing the perspective, we describe it not as a derivative cultural import, but the other way around, as an adaptation of local demands to the much broader implications with the aesthetic of the image that interested Bizan throughout his career, and for whom the encounter with Rauschenberg was rather an opportunity to broaden his horizons of understanding. At this point, I think that Hans Georg-Gadamer's description of understanding as a fusion of horizons may be useful. According to Jeff Malpass in Gadamerian phenomenology, the horizon is in general terms that larger context of meaning in which any meaningful presentation is situated. Inasmuch as understanding is taken to involve a fusion of horizons, then so it always involves the formation of a new context of meaning that enables integration of what is otherwise unfamiliar, strange, or anomalous. In this respect, all understanding involves a process of mediation and dialogue between what is familiar and what is alien, in which neither remains unaffected. Therefore, Bizan's disubjectification of figurative representation expands realism towards the territory of free-floating images that were circulated by socialist representational media. In turn, David Joseph's reading of Rauschenberg's mid-1960s compositions as a turning point within the history of painting, which, according to Josley, defined itself as a semiotic field expanding besides itself as a hub that arrests signifiers from the circulation in media culture, is enriched with a strong and destabilizing local political overtone once they are inserted in a different mediascape. In fact, Bizan's body of work occupies a somewhat unique position, being appreciated both internationally and nationally, and displaying an uncomfortable mixture of artworks that may be associated in turn with conceptual art, abstraction, pop minimalism, post-minimalism rather than minimalism, socialist realism as well, fusing formal experiment and purely aesthetic interest within a cunning obedience to political commands. Therefore, he is usually described as a dualistic artist, caught between official and unofficial art, living almost parallel lives. Some art critics echo this perplexity, some wondering, for instance, how many Ion Bizan exist. Through a transversal reading of the artworks presented in biennial exhibitions that were organized in Romania, and those presented in the Romanian participation to international biennials, that for obvious reasons I don't have time to develop here, but very hastily, I suggest that those problematic artworks do not represent mere local variations of globalized trends, but rather expand on his own experiments with various media that were presented through equally official channels in the West. Thus, instead of reading Bizan's cycles as contradictory instances of a double life, I believe there is rather a certain continuity that was facilitated by his own exhibitions and cultural encounters, whose common thread is not only the technique of the collage, but rather the critical analysis of image as a mental representation, a construction that goes through different stages of dematerialization, reduction to formless traces, painting from memory, and transmedial transference. This includes also the juxtaposition of ready-made images extracted from popular media. In between his 1964 participation to Venice and the 1970 artworks described as humanist realist compositions, Bizan experiments with graphic techniques such as etching and woodcut within a vocabulary that fuses informal representation with abstraction, and the latter being only revived in Romania after 1965-1967's recuperation of Brâncuși's work. This is paramount in the series of compositions presented, for instance, at the Ljubljana Graphic Arts Biennial, as well as in the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1969, but also in his works for the Romanian participation to the exhibition for Romanian artists set up in 1961 in Bauzentrum, Hamburg, that traveled to Richard de Marco Gallery the same year, and Alina Șerban has already constructed a wonderful documentation of what Richard de Marco has exhibited and worked with in Romania. Seen side by side, graphic works such as compositions and something like pages of history produced together with Vladimir Șetran for the exhibition Militant Graphics in 1970 paint the picture of a clear-cut stylistic divergence. But nevertheless, in a broader atlas of visual associations built rather on a rather loose Warburgian methodology, they display the same interest for the separation between the concrete existence of facts, the same reality conveyed by imagination, and the one mediated by images. So this type of artworks are the pleasure of making collage from 1968 that was exhibited in this exhibition. You can see it in here. This is a better image of that art piece, which has striking similarities with what he was doing in the other series that were dubbed Humanist Realism. So this may prove that Bizan was in fact tailoring his interest for different audiences. And the suggestion in this sense is also offered by an article signed by the reputed art critic and exhibition organizers Anca Arghir that was published in Romania Literară, Literary Romania in 1969, where the portrait of the technician Timar is described under the less intriguing label of new figuration, used also by others such as Piotr Piotrowski in relation to the broader spectrum of figurative art in Central and Eastern Europe. As it is well known, new figuration was first used in Europe by the French art critic Michel Ragon as a blanket term to refer to the return to figuration of the beginning of the 60s. More precisely, in conjunction with an exhibition at the Gallery Matthias Fels in Paris. In the Latin American context, it also occurred in conjunction with Otra Figuración, active in Argentina since 1961, or the Nueva Presencia in Mexico. According to Arghir, in the case of Bizan, it attests the belief, and now I'm quoting from this article, that art does not reflect outer world, but our images of the world deposited in consciousness. Neo-figurative language uses these images as documents of knowledge and reconstructs from them a version of reality mediated by concepts. Arghir concludes that besides the knowledge of outer reality, Bizan's figurative works also bring about important knowledge about the potentialities, but also the limits of representation. So we might conclude so far that Bizan's adoption of the new vocabulary, artistic vocabulary this time, not only helps him reflect on the potential separation between document and propaganda, achieved through his treatment of the imaginary mediated by press photography, but also continue his exploration of what today may be considered artistic knowledge achieved through research. This sharp dichotomic separation between a politically servile, on the one hand, and an experimental Bizan could be amended if the new avant-garde was indeed a product for export, circulated through official channels until the progressive reinforcement of a nationalized form of socialist realism in Romania after 1974, then we are offered another argument to revise the distinction between official and unofficial art as a historically effected prejudice derived from the retrospective glorification of aesthetic autonomy in the visual art of the 70s, which perhaps accompanied the globalization of neoliberal discourse after 1989. The other story that I would like to recount very briefly this time towards the end of today's presentation regards the uncanny circulation and the local adaptation of a concept aimed to describe the analytical artistic practices of Vanda Mihulac towards the end of the 1970s. This is an example of East-East circulation facilitated through its translation within the third space, that of the French cultural context. Common elements with Bizan's case are the interactions with international art through large-scale exhibitions, as well as the choice of graphic arts as an experimental medium. And just like Bizan, Vanda Mihulac was also by no means an underground artist. She occupied a rather privileged position, free-flowing between informal local artistic networks and the international art scene, and benefiting from state-supported networks. For instance, participated in 1972 in one of the most remarkable Romanian pavilions at the Venice Biennale, and later in Paris Biennale. In the case of Vanda Mihulac, the history of the term contextual art is perhaps that of a creative misinterpretation. The artist self-characterizes her work in relation to the concept that was coined by Jan Swidyński in 1975, most famously using it for her retrospective exhibition at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest in 2018. Vanda's encounter with the term contextual art was retrospective and was facilitated by her close connections with the French cultural environment. It arrived actually through the French connection of Hervé Fischer at the beginning of the 80s in her work, and much later through Paul Arden's book. As Juliane Debaucher already documented, Fischer brought Swidyński's concept to France after participating in an exhibition in Warsaw in 1975, associating it to his own sociological art. The common elements between the two artists are the participatory engagement with audience and social context, as well as the decentering of the artwork from its autonomy predicated within the gallery space, conceiving it as a social tool in a rather interventionist manner. While this was a socially engaged activity which may have been politically motivated by the shared intention to ameliorate Marxism rather than to overcome it. In Wanda Mihulac's case, she uses it as an aesthetically depoliticized way to describe the special position of some of her works as self-erasing signifiers. Actually, between 1975 and 1986, Wanda created works which reflected the surrounding space by means of mirrors, water, and other elements. But this series of artwork can be read in relation to other tautological pieces, such as shadows, written with shadows, or earth, written in earth. And here you can see that the international language of communication by choice was the French one in her case, so she writes terre. Which addressed on the conjunction between written and visual language, doubling the significance of the written word within the materiality of the signifier. Such artworks would aptly fit, perhaps, within the category of analytical conceptual art. And the latter artwork is particularly interesting from this perspective because it was presented as a graphic work within the Ljubljana Biennial of Graphic Arts. And as Gregor Dražel pointed out in an article published by the Institute of the Present, it seems that Romanian artists, among others, used the medium of the print as an opportunity to circulate experimental art within broader international circles. However, replacing the globally established term conceptual art with a certainly more limited contextual art is not a mere artistic caprice. It actually allowed Wanda to account for a progressive demise of authorial subjectivity in her works that culminated after 1989, in her case, with a fascination for the theory of deconstruction. Also, it allows her to account for her activity of exhibition organizer in 1980s, where she was building up temporary curatorial collectives in conjunction with art critics such as Mihai Drișcu, or artists such as Călin Dan or Decebal Scriba. The symptomatic event that generated this interpretation, I believe, is her participation to the 1972 Romanian Pavilion of Venice Biennale, together with 19 other graphic artists. Although the commissioner was Ion Frunzetti, the idea of tearing apart and combining the graphic arts of all the artists in unpredictable assemblages belonged to the artist Marcel Chirnoagă, who motivated it as a reenactment of the medieval notion of acting like craftsmen within a guild, but this time in the service of society. The result was a dismissal of authority and authoriality in favor of collective agency. It resulted in a stylistically hybrid collage of fragments extracted from each artist's works and disassembled in tensed configuration. This practice, together with the favorable international art critical reception, made a lasting impression on the artist. While international critics saw in it a continuation of perhaps décollage, while others politically interpreted it as a symptom of collective rebellion, it was presented in Romania by Frunzetti as a plea for humanism, motivated by the same theory of humanist socialism. The art critic interpreted it as a neurotic symptom, signaling the chaos that a depersonalized humanity repleted with anthropophagous machines that were presented in some of Wanda's graphic works presented at that time. In conclusion, cultural transfer may perhaps be interpreted as an active selection, an incorporation and reuse of an artistic or conceptual vocabulary that, in a new idiomatic usage, retrospectively alters and broadens the meaning of a term. Some of them were forged in connection with local artistic policies, attempted to, and often failed to, accommodate the frictions that resulted from distant inter- or transnational cultural interactions. In our case, it was just international connection mediated in this imaginary space of dialogue. Circulating across borders, other concepts arrived late, offering a conceptual motivation and legitimizing internationally what was already happening locally. Nevertheless, it becomes clear that state organizations that facilitated international circulation of artists were not only instruments of coercion and control, but also facilitated pluridirectional cultural communication, speaking simultaneously to different audiences. Paying attention to both the limiting and the constructive role of historically effected prejudices in interpreting cultural exchanges might also allow us to offer a constructive role in artistic subjectivity to what are perhaps wrongfully described sometimes as mere exterior political constraints that could have been heroically resisted by an autonomous free subject, which may be the case for some artists, but certainly not for this type of artists that I presented that enjoyed this privilege within Romanian art. Instead, one should acknowledge the intelligent use of the facilities of official institutions in order to advance aesthetic experiments and integrate, which was the key word, within the international community. They facilitated not only the circulation of ideas, it's the last sentence I have, and representational techniques outside the social and political context in which they're initially generated, but also their incorporation within a local artistic language, which was commonly motivated by already existing subjective interest and by politically reinforced cultural constraints. Thank you for your attention.